Jayasinghe. I am speaking to you from Jindal Global University in Sonipat in India. I welcome you all. Many of you are beaming in from India. Many of you are beaming in from Australia. So welcome and good evening to my Australian brothers and sisters and colleagues, or should I say our brothers and sisters and colleagues. I'm very excited about this event. This is actually a discussion on something that's close to my heart, which is talking about media. But before we get there, I should introduce the broader series. This is an initiative, a co-hosted initiative from Jindal Global University, JGU, and the Australia-India Institute based out of the University of Melbourne. And this is in celebration of the co-hosted India Week series of activities. I'll talk more about that toward the end of our session today. We have a wonderful showcasing of a series of panel discussions on various aspects of the India-Australia bilateral relationship, talking about it from the point of view of cultural history, talking about it, for example, from the point of view of sociological aspects of Indian society, as well as looking at some of the sort of geopolitical issues around the Indo-Pacific as well. But we'll talk about that later on. Today, we have a fascinating discussion by one of our esteemed historians in, might I say, our business school here at Jindal Global University. So I have Professor Saumya Day, who is actually a cultural historian, and he will be speaking to us today about Indian media, essentialized narratives in Indian media. I'll get to that in a moment, but just a bit about Professor Saumya Day. He's one of our esteemed associate professors of history here at JGBS, Jindal Global Business School, and his primary research interests are in intellectual and cultural history. He has, till date, authored one monograph. I'm just partly reading from his bio here, one monograph and a collection of essays called Becoming Hindus and Muslims, reading the cultural encounter in Bengal, 1342. I thought that was 1942, but indeed it's 1342 to 1905. And he's also written The Cultural Landscape of Hindutva and Other Essays, Historical Legitimacy of an Idea. He earned his PhD at the Center for Historical Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, here in Delhi. So just before I introduce Professor Saumya Day and his talk, a bit about me. I'm the moderator. I don't want to take any sort of time here. My name's Professor Laknath, Jayasinghe, as I mentioned. I am actually an Australian by birth, and for much of my life, I come from Melbourne. My two of my degrees are indeed from Melbourne University. My first degree, my bachelor's, and my PhD in cultural anthropology at Melbourne Business School. I've taught, of course, in many fine Australian institutions. And 3 years ago, I made a very brave and bold and, dare I say it, unbelievably satisfying trip across the Indian Ocean to India to start work at Jindal Global University. So I'm going to hand it over to Professor Saumya Day. The title of his seminar today is Of Idols, Subalterns and False Constructs, Essentialized Narratives of India in Western Media and Academia. It shapes up to be a fascinating seminar, and toward the end, we do welcome any questions. Perhaps the way that we might format the questions is if you can type your questions into the chat function, and toward the end, Professor Day tells me his seminar will end in about 40 to 45 minutes. So we'll have about 20, 25 minutes for a Q&A. So if you plonk your questions into the chat function, at the end of the session, I will moderate the questions and we can have quite a productive, hopefully quite a vigorous and enlivening discussion at the end. So over to my colleague, Professor Saumya Day, over to you, and I hope we have a wonderful discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Laknath, and thanks a lot for the generous introduction, that elaborate and generous introduction. I do not consider myself a historian, though. I consider myself a student of the discipline of history, and I think I'm still learning the ropes of it, still figuring out the elements that constitute this vast expanse that is history. You've been told the topic for, and by the way, good afternoon and good evening to my colleagues based in India and Australia. I'm very glad to have got this opportunity of speaking before you and to interact with you. So I look forward to a very fruitful exchange with you. But before that, I'll give my talk, the title of which is of Idols, Subalterns and False Constructs, Essentialized Narratives of India in Western Media and Academia. So what I have in mind is that, and as Professor Laknath has told you already, I shall speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then 20 to 15 minutes we shall set aside for Q&A or for an informal interaction, for a discussion of sorts. So as about the structure of my talk, what I have in mind is that first I shall discuss what constitutes a narrative, the formal aspect of a narrative, the ontology of a narrative. And thereafter, I shall move on to the representational function of a narrative. How does a narrative represent? To whom does it represent? And how does it essentialize? Sometimes, for example, what is there about a narrative that might cause it to essentialize its subjects? And then we shall move on, or I shall move on to these topoi or tropes, idols, subaltern, etc. And I shall try to kind of dwell upon their essentializing functions. So this is the format that I have in mind. And just in case, if I digress from the topic, I do that sometimes. I request my colleague, Professor Jayasinghe, to bring me back on track. Please remind me that I'm digressing. It happens to me sometimes. So that is your responsibility, Professor Jayasinghe.
Certainly will, certainly will.
Well, so let us begin. What is a narrative? What makes a narrative? What constitutes a narrative? What is a narrative in its formal sense, in its ontological sense? Well, I shall dwell on this matter with reference to two individuals. I do not know how to peg them. I do not know how to describe them. The names are Hayden White and Paul Ricoeur, whom I read as a student, and recently I have been rereading their works. Very stimulating, very interesting. Since, as I told you, as I said, I do not know how to peg them, how to describe them, I shall call them philosophers of the narrative. So there are two rather dense monographs that these individuals have authored. They've written a great deal else, of course, but especially two monographs which are very vital from the point of view of what I'm going to talk about now. Hayden White's Metahistory and Paul Ricoeur's Memory, History, and Forgetting. So Hayden White writes in Metahistory that narratives are verbal structures. According to Hayden White, a narrative is a verbal structure. It is a certain configuration of language. And these verbal structures generate meanings. And especially coming to a discipline like history, these verbal structures, these narratives, generating meanings are absolutely essential. According to Paul Ricoeur, as he writes in Memory, History, and Forgetting, narratives are very fundamental to the historiographical function. They cannot serve as a substitute for meaning, but they definitely supply meanings. So narratives are very vital. I again emphasize what I said with reference to Hayden White and Paul Ricoeur. Narratives are verbal structures, they generate meanings. And especially with reference coming to a discipline like history, they're absolutely fundamental, they're very fundamental to the historiographical function. Narratives, they also supply normativity. They might highlight, they might supply, they might create moral datums. In fact, Hayden White writes in another of his works, whose title escapes me, by the way, at the moment. Hayden White writes that narratives are the outcome of the human desire to moralize reality. We derive a moral sense from reality by narrativizing reality. So narratives might also supply moral datums. They might supply these moral takeaways. Think of all the fables, all the fairy tales, all over the world. The Aesop's fables, for example, they inevitably lead to a moral takeaway. So narratives serve these very vital functions. They apprehend reality. They are a means to apprehend reality. They are a means to moralize reality. Narratives are very fundamental to being human, you know. And if you've read this very interesting book by the Israeli anthropologist, well, Israeli by origin, but probably based in the United States, I'm not very sure, Yuval Harari, his books, Sapiens, and he propounds this very interesting idea that human beings are not just tool-making animals, human beings are storytelling animals. And so many things, you know, all the paraphernalia of being human are actually stories. A state is a story. A sense of nationhood is a story, you know, or for that matter, since I teach in a business school, even a business organization is a story. You know, the beginning of this story is a stamp paper or drafted, you know, a legal document drafted by a lawyer and signed probably by the founders of the company. That is a story. So a sense of narratives, the tendency to narrativize is very fundamental to being human. We apprehend reality through narratives. We moralize reality through narratives. So these are some very fundamental functions of narratives. Moving on, narratives also serve a representational function. And this is because the narratives require characters. Now, these characters need not necessarily be human beings. These characters might be of various different sorts. Talking of, you know, historical narratives, my references every now and then, my reference points every now and then would be historical narratives, because as I told you, I'm a student of the discipline of history. So now talking of historical narratives, these characters around which narratives or verbal structures are configured could be of various sorts. These could be individuals, these could be institutions, these could be national groups, and in certain cases, very rare instances, the character could even be geography. It could be the environment. So to give you some examples of this, Nietzsche, for example, it is not widely known that Nietzsche also authored a sort of theoretical treatise on historiography. If I remember the title correctly, it is called Theory and Practice of History. So in Theory and Practice of History, Nietzsche categorized different kinds of histories. You know, he identified a taxonomy of histories, and one kind of history he termed monumental. And what is a monumental history? According to Nietzsche, monumental history is the record of great occurrences. It is a record of great deeds. So one might say that, you know, in such a kind of historiography, in such a sort of historical narrative, there is much room for the individual actor. So certain kinds of historiographic narratives, historical narratives, it could be about individual actors. The heroic history, for example, the great hero. Recently, I bought a biography of Napoleon, and that is one instance of a heroic history. Moving on, of course, certain histories, it could be about institutions. If you write the history of a state, for example, Livy and Polybius wrote histories of Rome. That is an institution. That is an institutional history. And to give you a more mundane example of an institutional history, mundane but still interesting, John Key's history of the East India Company, the history of a business organization. That is another example of institutional history. Moving on, well, histories of national groups are galore, you know, since the days of Ranke. One of the main focuses of historiographic narratives have been national groups. And well, to give you some examples, some of the best narratives of this sort that I've read recently are Robert Toombs' The English and Their History, Geoffrey Barraclough's Rise of Modern Germany, a history of the Germans, the German people. Then to give you another example, Geoffrey Hosking's Russia and the Russians. Well, this is the commonest sort of history of national groups. So once again, to reiterate, what am I talking about here? What am I emphasizing here? I'm emphasizing how these verbal structures, these plot structures called narratives are configured. You know, they're configured around the characters. And thus, by configuring around characters, these plot structures, these verbal structures perform a representational role. And by the way, I had skipped one example, how geography or environment might also play a character role in a historical narrative. An example of this is Brauddel's Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the age of Philip II. And some critiques said that the hero in this historical narrative is the Mediterranean Ocean. A giant tome, actually, a series of giant tomes, which I'm yet to read. Probably I'll read them post-retirement. They're that giant. Each volume runs into 1,400 to 1,500 pages. I call this class of monographs. I have a name for this, this kind of monographs, Bibliopithecus giganticus, but I'm digressing here. Anyway, so verbal structures or plot structures called narratives are a means to apprehend reality. They're a means to moralize reality. And these verbal structures or plot structures perform a representational function because they require characters. They require these nodal points around which they configure. They bind themselves rather, they hinge upon these nodal points. And I've given you some examples of how or what kind of characters these narratives might have in a discipline such as history. It could be individuals, institutions, it could be national groups, it could be even the environmental geography in certain cases, an ocean such as the Mediterranean, sorry, a sea such as the Mediterranean Sea. Now, narratives or verbal structures, the plot structures are not always equally competent. They are not always equally well configured. Sometimes they're incompetently configured, sometimes they're competently configured, sometimes they're well written, sometimes they're badly written. You, for example, cannot compare Proust or Dostoevsky with a $1 paperback. That's of a different. That's a very different kind of narrative. You cannot compare, for example, to put it in plain language, literary fiction with pulp fiction. So narratives are of different qualities. Narratives are of a different level of competence. And hence, the representational function of narratives too differs. And they too are of a different. The representational function of narratives too are of a different level. So sometimes the narratives, of course, tend to essentialize. As they apprehend reality, as they moralize reality, they also tend, of course, judging reality and judging what constitutes morality is a part of this apprehension. So sometimes they can be essentializing. Sometimes they can essentialize in their subject matter. I hope you are clear about where I'm heading now. I've told you that narratives apprehend reality, they moralize reality, they configure around the characters, and sometimes while serving this representational function, while they configure around the characters, they also essentialize their subject matter. Now the question emerges, what is essentialization? What does it mean to essentialize? I've given you my opinion or my understanding of what is a narrative, and I've told you that narratives serve this representational function. Now let us move on to what is essentialization. Now, as I discuss essentialization, I shall again revert to Hayden White, and I shall refer to one individual, one scholar I've not mentioned yet in my talk. It is R.G. Collingwood. Now, Hayden White, I've told you about him, or I've given you my opinion of him. I do not know how to peg him. He's a narrative philosopher. This is the best description of him that I can provide. As about R.G. Collingwood, once again, hard to classify, a philosopher historian, a philosopher of history. So talking about this monograph by Hayden White, he writes in it that narratives can sometimes function as a mode of argumentation. He talks about various functionalities of narratives, and one of the functionalities of a narrative is a mode of argumentation. Other functionalities, to give you other examples, mode of ideological implication, mode of employment, etc., etc. But one of the functionality of a narrative is mode of argumentation. You propound ideas through a narrative, you argue, you make contentions. We all know this, don't we? So a narrative is a mode of argumentation. And there are different modes of argumentation according to Hayden White. One of the modes of argumentation according to him is the mechanistic mode of argumentation or the reductive mode of argumentation. Well, to give you other examples, formist, other examples that he talks about, formist, organicist, contextualist, etc. But let us not venture into that territory. Let us not complicate things unnecessarily. So as a mode of argumentation, Hayden White writes, a narrative could be mechanistic, that is reductive. And what is the most obvious example? What could be the most obvious example of a mechanistic or reductive mode of argumentation? Definitely the Marxian idea of history or the Marxian schema of history, the materialist interpretation of history. In this interpretation of history, causality is ascribed to class struggle, to changes in the modes of production, to emergence of new productive forces within modes of production, which in turn causes further class struggle and causes these modes of production to change. That is the Marxian scheme of history, and it is, of course, very reductive because historical developments, historical occurrences are always traced back to class struggle or changes or tensions within modes of production. It is a mechanistic way of interpreting history. It is a reductive way of interpreting history. So this could be, in my opinion, this is one example of essentialization, the Marxist interpretation of history. It is an essentializing interpretation of history because what essence that we are looking at in any historical situation, if we adopt the Marxian schema of history, we're looking for the economic essence. And we interpret human beings primarily as the homo economicus, so to speak. Our essence is our economic self, the way, the role that we perform in these production regimes called modes of production. So this is, in my opinion, one form of essentializing, the reductive or mechanistic way of talking about your subject matter. You reduce a subject matter, you kind of always trace back the ontology of your subject matter to a fundamental something. In the Marxian schema, it is the production regime. So here is one example of essentialization, the reductive or mechanistic way of talking about your subject matter. Another example, let us move on to another example of essentialization. Here, in this instance, I shall refer to R.G. Collingwood, whom I described as a philosopher historian. So in his idea of history, he talks about various kinds of histories, and he discusses these histories written in classical antiquity. He discusses in the Greco-Roman historical tradition. And while discussing the Greco-Roman historical tradition, R.G. Collingwood brings up two historians whom I had, by the way, referred to earlier in my talk, Livy and Polybius. Both have written monumental histories of Rome. The titles I cannot remember at the moment because I'm bad at remembering Latin titles. Of course, they have lengthy, pompous Latin titles. So Livy and Polybius, two Roman historians, have written monumental histories of Rome. And these histories are truly monumental because they span generations, they span centuries. So characters come and go, generations come and go, and Caesars, emperors come and go in these histories. But what remains unchanging, what remains immutable is Rome itself. Rome the city, Rome the state, Rome the empire. These historians, according to R.G. Collingwood, ascribe a certain immutability to Rome. Rome is an idea, Rome is an essence, Rome is a form, remains immutable throughout these histories. And he calls this tendency in Livy and Polybius, R.G. Collingwood calls this tendency in Livy and Polybius substantialism. Rome, so to speak, I'm paraphrasing R.G. Collingwood here, Rome, so to speak, is ascribed to some kind of a substance, an immutable substance, an immutable essence. So this is, in my opinion, another instance of essentialization. You ascribe your subject matter some kind of an immutable substance, which remains unchanging no matter what, which remains unchanging irrespective of a time and space, an essence which is there no matter what. This is, in my opinion, the second form of essentialization, which narratives, and especially historical narratives, might resort to. Wittingly, unwittingly, knowingly, unknowingly, it might happen. So where do we stand at this talk? At this juncture, let me briefly reprise myself. When I began, I told you that narratives are verbal structures. I also called narratives plot structures. And narratives are a means to apprehend reality and moralize reality. Narratives, of course, require characters. They are configured around the characters, and thus they perform a representational function. Now, while narratives perform these representational functions, they could be well configured, they could be ill configured, they could be competent, incompetent, and sometimes they could be essentializing. Here on, I moved on and discussed what constitutes essentializing, or what makes for essentializing. And I've given you two examples of what, in my opinion, are instances of essentialization. First is the mechanistic or the reductive mode, reductive manner of talking about your subject matter. And the second is the substantialist tendency. You assume that there is an immutable essence about your subject matter, which remains unchanging no matter what. Now, seen from both points of view, I think there's a problem about it. There's a very fundamental problem about the Western narratives on India, be it the journalistic narratives or be it the academic narratives. We see, at least I see the reductive tendency in these narratives. I also see the substantialist tendency in these narratives. There's this wonderful monograph, by the way, which you might want to look up. It is authored by Ronald Linden, and it is called Imagining India. And Ronald Linden discusses, it came out when in the 90s or probably late 80s at some point of time. I do not remember when it was published, but a great work of scholarship. So Ronald Linden talks about through what frames, through what templates in the West has interpreted India since the 18th century. And he identifies 3 templates, primarily caste, 2 templates, caste and religion, which supplied the essence of India in Western eyes. And of course, he traces problems in these templates and provides an alternative, suggests an alternative manner of looking at India. But that is a different matter. I'm digressing once again. Let us leave aside Ronald Linden and his monograph and let us get on subject matter. So yes, as I said, I still notice a problem to Western narratives on India. I think they still display the reductive tendency and the substantialist tendency. It is a problematic tendency. And I think the 2 words that are contained in the title of my talk, idle and subaltern, exemplify this tendency. Both are problematic, both are reductive and substantialist. And these are usages which problematize. I mean, frequently, we are not aware of the politics of a term as a journalist or even as an academic. If you're a young PhD scholar, a young PhD candidate, you might not be aware of the politics behind the terminology that you're employing. So I would not say that it is always tendentious. This essentializing tendency in Western media or academia is tendentious. It could be innocent. It could be born out of a sheer ignorance of the politics that these words contain. But nevertheless, this problem remains. And as I said, the 2 words idle and subaltern exemplify this problem. What is the problem, and how do these terms essentialize India, the Indian scene, the Indian situation? Let me dwell on this a bit. It is 3 o'clock already. I shall do that for the next 10 to 15 minutes, and then we may have a little discussion on what I have spoken before you. Now, the word idle is always employed when we discuss Indian spirituality. If you discuss Indian temple architecture, for example, there would be umpteen references to idols carved on the spire of the temple, idols installed in the sanctorum of the temple. Indians themselves use this word to talk about their own unique spirituality. But both Indians and Westerners, unfortunately, are not aware that the word idol contains a pejorative charge. It is a pejorative, and it was originally employed as a pejorative. There's this excellent monograph that I would bring up at this point in my talk. The title of the monograph is Idolatry and the Colonial Image of India. It is authored by this individual called Swagato Ganguly. I don't know how well noticed this monograph has been. I think it deserves to be better noticed and deserves to be reviewed more commonly. I have not seen too many reviews of this monograph. An excellent bit of cultural study, by the way. So Swagato Ganguly discusses in this monograph, Swagato Ganguly discusses how the image of the idol served as a kind of entry point into India for 18th century colonizers and later even for 19th century Indologists. So idolatry, or the image of the idol, according to Swagato Ganguly, became a totalizing image for India. And it stood for the otherness of India. It stood for the exoticness of India. And it also stood for the irrationality of India, and sometimes for the immorality of Indians, especially Hindus, who venerated these representations, anthropomorphic representations. So what were the colonial assumptions? What were the colonial assumptions when they employed this term, mildly pejorative term, idol? And in what senses and in what terms did they understand India through this usage? So to briefly sum up the contentions of Swagato Ganguly, he writes that in the Western vision, for example, the Indian veneration of these anthropomorphic representations, which were called idols, indicated that Indians are stuck with the material. Indians are stuck with the form. Indians are stuck with the surface appearance. They cannot go beyond the surface appearance of things. And this indicated irrationality. This indicated delusion. So Indians, according to these colonialists, according to individuals, according to an individual such as William Jones, for example, who was a Sanskritist, by the way, were delusional. You know, the Indian spirituality was delusional, and Indian spirituality also contained the seeds of, also contained the roots of Indian immorality. Indians were seen as an immoral people. Why? Because idols or these representations are of an infinite variety. You visit a Hindu temple, the temples of Khajuraho, or any South Indian temple, for example, you would see hundreds of thousands of these representations carved upon the spire. So this is something that I'm saying, the Indian idea or the Indian imagining of the divine is very polyimaginative, you know, it is infinitely profuse. So idols or these representations too were infinitely profuse. But Swagato Ganguly writes, or rather, this is why Swagato Ganguly writes in his monograph that in the colonial vision, in the colonial eyes, in the colonialists' eyes, Indian subjectivity was fractured, since Indian imagination was so fractured. You know, Indian subjectivity was fractured, Indians apprehended the divine in so many different ways, and this somehow indicated that Indians do not apprehend the divine at all. Indians cannot imagine the divine, Indians cannot grasp the divine truth. You know, since Indian subjectivity is so fractured. The word that he uses is a heteroglossia. I encountered this term first when I read Bakhtin, by the way. Heteroglossia means a diversity of ways of talking about something, anything. So these representations, termed idols in colonial vision, indicated heteroglossia, or a very diverse way of talking about the divine. They indicated a fracturing of Indian subjectivity, and thus the colonialists thought that Indians are incapable of grasping divine truth, and hence Indians are immoral. You know, Indian religion, Indian spirituality is fundamentally immoral. So this is how using the word idol, or using the idol as a totalizing image for India, as an epitome of India, so to speak, the colonialists imagined India or understood India. And I think every time you use the word idol, you kind of summon this history, and even if it is an innocent usage, it keeps you. Indians too, I mean, it is not just a Western problem. Indians themselves use the term profusely, commonly, the term idol. But whenever you use it, it kind of blocks your genuine understanding of Indian spirituality, Indian religiosity. You fail to understand it in its own terms. And of course, it serves an essentializing function, because you're summoning this colonial history. The word bears this colonial history, so to speak. The commensurate Indian terms, by the way, are murti and vigraha, and they, of course, they mean something very different. I mean, the roughest translation that I can offer here is that, of course, I'm ignorant of the Sanskrit language. The roughest translation, the easiest translation that I can offer here is a manifestation and an ideograph. So this so-called idol, or the so-called idols, are a combination of a manifestation and an ideograph. You know, these are not venerations of appearance, as it was assumed. All right, so let us move on. So idols indicated Indian irrationality. Idols essentialized India and Indians as irrational, and Indians as irrational and immoral. Now, you might find this a little incredible, but the word idol finds a coval. The word idol finds a kinship in the concept, in the construct of the subaltern, because the premise of the construct of the subaltern is also Indian irrationality. You know, the term subaltern originally meant a young new recruit, new army recruit, or a junior officer in the army. But now in academia, the word has come to acquire a different meaning altogether. And the root of this meaning is in the writings, is in the opinions of an Italian Marxist called Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci lived in Italy. Well, he was jailed in 1929, if I remember right, and he was released in 1935. So he spent a total of 7 years in jail, and he wrote a lot in jail. And then, well, he propounded this idea of a subaltern as the non-elite invisible in history. So this is the original sense in which this Italian Marxist, Antonio Gramsci, used the word idol. By the usage, he meant the non-elite invisible in history. So this Gramscian usage served as the entry point for this research collective for this research project called the Subaltern Studies, which by the way started in Australia at the Australian National University in the early 1980s. I think the early volumes came out around 81, 82, if I remember correctly, and the project continued till the early 2000s. It concluded, I think, around 2002, 3, once again, if I remember correctly. So the project lasted a couple of decades. Anyway, so the Subaltern Studies project began in Australia at the Australian National University in the early 1980s, and the entry point for this project was this Marxian Gramscian idea that subalterns are the non-elite, invisible in history. And the prime architect of this project was a gentleman, well, his name is Ranajit Guha, Professor Ranajit Guha, who was then at the Australian National University. Now, I had said a few moments ago that the two terms, the two usages, idle and subaltern, share a kinship because the premise of the two usages is once again Indian irrationality. Now, the Subaltern Studies project was meant to serve as work as a kind of historical corrective. You know, the subalterns, the Indian subalterns who have been invisible in history were meant to be rendered visible by their efforts, especially in colonial India, you know, in the history of colonial India. The subaltern was meant to be fleshed out by this project. However, I think it still amounted to a very problematic effort due to their imagining of the subaltern. And what was this imagining like? I think it was a very essentializing colonialist imagining, and it was a very condescending imagining. There are multiple problems with this imagining. I do not like it, frankly speaking. So some fundamentals some fundamental tropes of this imagining are to be found in this monograph authored by Professor Ranajit Guha, Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency in Colonial India. This monograph was first published in 1983, as I remember now, while the Subaltern Studies project was picking up. So as I said, some fundamentals of the imagining of the subaltern, some fundamental tropes, topoi through which Professor Guha imagined and conceptualized the subaltern are to be found in this monograph, Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency in Colonial India. How did he imagine the subaltern? It was a very problematic imagining, in my opinion, a very essentializing and colonialist and condescending imagining. The subaltern in case is the peasant. And how did he imagine the Indian peasantry? Well, as he writes, I'll give you just two instances. It's a long monograph running into 300 odd pages. So as Professor Guha imagined, the Indian peasantry did not even possess a self-reflexive identity. What is a self-reflexive identity? An identity that is capable of dwelling on itself. You know, I bear a name, Saumya, and I can dwell on myself. You know, I'm self-reflexive. Professor Jayasinghe is self-aware. He can dwell on himself. He's self-reflexive. But as Professor Guha understood and imagined the Indian peasantry, he thought that Indian peasantry did not even have a self-reflexive identity. You know, it was not capable of it. The Indian peasantry could only imagine what it was not. That is, it could only think of itself as the non-elite, as the other of the elite. And also problematic is his idea of what constituted the politics of this non-reflexive peasantry. Professor Guha argues in this monograph that the politics of the Indian peasantry was just violence, and it manifested itself, this politics, the so-called politics of the peasantry, manifested itself as random acts of eating, looting, and burning. I'm literally quoting his choice of words here. Eating, looting, and burning constituted the politics of the peasantry. Strangely, however, you know, Professor Guha ignored a ton of evidence to the contrary. Indian peasantry, for example, was the fulcrum of a Gandhian civil disobedience, and Indian peasantry copiously, in millions, participated in Gandhian civil disobedience. In fact, Gandhian civil disobedience, when it was launched in 1930, it took the form of a full-fledged peasant upsurge, a peaceful upsurge, though. However, Professor Guha completely ignored this evidence and this historical reality. That is his problem. I shall not try to unravel his mind here in this talk. That is not my purpose. So this is how, you know, this is how he imagined the peasantry, or the great mass of the Indian subalterns. And this problematic imagining of the subaltern, imagination of the subaltern, is to be found throughout the output of the Subaltern Studies Collective, the Subaltern Studies Project. The subaltern studies scholars, they imagined an alternative, non-elite domain of politics, the subaltern domain of politics. And they also imagined that this domain is determined by this unique subaltern psychology, which is completely different from elite psychology. And the most obvious manifestations of the psychology are in these random acts of impulse and violence. That is, in the simple language, irrationality. Random acts of impulse, violence, and irrationality constituted the subaltern. So, well, that is essentializing, and that is not a very subtle imagination of the subaltern, in my opinion, because there is a ton of evidence to the contrary. There's a ton of evidence that the subaltern was capable of politics. If we understand the politics as a set of relationalities and strategizing, then definitely the Indian subaltern was and continues to be capable of it, which is the reason why India continues to be a democracy. You know, if the Indian subaltern was not capable of political imagination, it wouldn't be so. But unfortunately, the subaltern studies scholars, the subaltern studies collective, thought to the contrary, and probably continues to think to the contrary. So it is nearly 45 minutes. My computer shows 3:11 as the time. I shall be concluding now over the next 2 or 3 minutes. So, well, idle and subaltern, both serve an essentializing function, and both essentialize India as irrational. And subaltern, the construct of the subaltern also essentializes Indian, or the great mass of Indians, as irrational, impulsive, and violent. And these imaginations, by the way, continue to inform representations of India. Journalistic representations of India, academic representations of India. I do not have the time in this talk to go over all instances, but just to give you one example, for instance, talking of the journalistic interpretations of the electoral verdict delivered by Indians in 2019, the major Western dailies, the major Western publications. So it is a manifestation of Indian religious impulse, for example, religious nationalism, as they termed it. I understand that verdict very, very differently, by the way. And I think Indian irrationality, Indian impulsiveness, culturally conditioned impulsiveness, continues to be a trope in the academic output on India in the West. I'm not inducting, I mean, this is not a post-colonial wine fest, by the way. I'm not inducting the Western folks of doing this. I mean, Indians do this as much as Westerners, but I'm just emphasizing, I'm just underlining that this imagination of India as a domain of the irrational, as a domain of the impulse, culturally determined impulse, is still a problem. Nearly 3:15, as my computer shows. So over to you, Professor Jayasinghe, and maybe we can have a little exchange now.
Thank you, Professor Saumya. That was a fascinating discussion, fascinating insights into historical imagination from both an academic and also sort of commercial media, journalistic media point of view. I'm going to throw it open to the audience now, and if any of the audience members out there have any queries or comments or issues to take up with Professor Day, perhaps you can, the best way to do so would be to write your comments in the chat function to me, and I can read them out, and we can ask Professor Day to address them. So do I have any comments or queries? Any sort of concerns or issues or any opinions on Professor Day's discussion? Okay, so I have a comment here, a question here from Professor Pavan Gandok, who is one of our professors in the business school, who's from Australia, might I say, and he's one of the he's also one of the organizers of this wonderful Australia India Week co-hosted series of events. He has asked Professor Day to please share some views regarding instances in modern day times how this plays out. So can you, I'm wondering if you can talk about, so you've talked about the historical project, and I'm wondering where we are 2015 to 2020, even going back as 2010 to 2020. How do these narratives play out in terms of, are they being still supported, or is there some resistance, or has, say, for example, the Indian diaspora, for example, I mean, my parents are from a Sri Lankan background, but I know that the diaspora in the Sri Lankan and Indian diaspora in many parts of the West sort of are now moving into positions of power and influence where they can sort of shape the narrative. So I'm going to throw that out to you, and perhaps you can have some words on Professor Gandok's comment.
Well, yes. To respond to that, good question, an interesting question.
And if I can just add one other, Professor Gandok has said, especially the misrepresentation of subaltern voices. That's especially where he'd like to guide the discussion.
Oh, well, Professor Gandok, the misrepresentation of subaltern voices is done most commonly and most done by people who claim to speak for the subalterns. For example, I earned my PhD at JNU, which is Jawaharlal Nehru University, which is a very so-called, supposedly, allegedly radical space. And it is teeming with people who claim to speak for the subaltern. But I think they misrepresent the subaltern as they claim to speak for the subaltern. I mean, what is the standard representation, extreme left, radical left representation of subaltern? That the Indian subaltern is alienated from the Indian state. The Indian subaltern is alienated from the dominant form of Indian, the communist manifestations of Indian spirituality and so forth. But as about my experience of the subaltern, it is completely different. I think the Indian subaltern is completely invested in the Indian state. And the Indian subaltern is actually the upholder of paradigms of Indian religiosity, Indian spirituality. And well, moving on to current representations of India, academic and journalistic representations of India. I mean, you just leaf through editions of the Washington Post and the Guardian and so forth. What reportage of India that you commonly find in these publications? I mean, they seem to exoticize India as this realm of violence, irrational, impulsive violence. It is generally the worst news about India that gets reported in these dailies. That is what I see. Once again, I mean, this is not a post-colonial wine fest. A lot of this reportage is done by Indians, of course. But I think it is a paradigm it is a frame of looking at India which is very colonialist still. I mean, I'm not saying that we are all roses and unicorns here. Every country has its problems, and India is an enormous country with an enormous population and enormous disparities. We have our share of problems. But I think there is a great deal more to report about India than these impulsive acts of violence. I mean, you get the general idea what I'm talking about, I'm not going into the details because I'm not into a post-colonial wine fest. You have definitely scanned through these dailies and you know what I'm talking about. And moving on to the academic representations of India, what I find curious about these representations is that Indian self-awareness is not taking into account. Indian historical self-awareness is not taking into account in these academic representations, academic studies of India at all. So in social sciences, we talk about these two kinds of terminology, amic and etic terminology. And I think amic terminology is, correct me, Professor Jayasinghe, if I'm wrong. As I remember now, amic terminology is what is native to a culture, native to a society, and etic is the exotic terminology. So we discuss, in academia, we discuss India only in etic terms. An idol is an etic term. Indian languages do not have a commensurative for this term. The words that we use are murti and vigraha, and they indicate a very different reality altogether, a very different perception of reality altogether. Once again, I'm not a theologian and I'm not a scholar of Sanskrit, so my ability to dwell on this issue is limited. But all I would say here is that when you use a term such as idol to represent, to talk about Indian religiosity, you obscure a lot of this religiosity itself. You misrepresent this religiosity. Once again, the word caste, For example, it is a Portuguese word meaning a bloodline. And when we talk about the caste system, we are actually flattening out a lot of diverse realities. We are flattening out, for example, the diversity within the jati system. The traditional term for these endogamous social groups in India has been jati. Indians learned this term pretty late. So, and talking about the jati system, it is not quite a hierarchy. It is not, in fact, it is not a hierarchy at all. It is a pool of contending status claims, as I understand it today. But when you use a phrase such as a caste system to describe Indian social realities, you indicate immediately kind of imagine a hierarchy and you imagine a rigidity, which is actually not there. The jati system historically has been very fluid, and jatis have moved up the social ladder continuously throughout Indian history. And in fact, talking about Indian political history, a vast number of Indian dynasties, a truly large number of Indian dynasties have actually emerged from jatis whose ritual status has been very low indeed. So if your imagination of this jati system is supplied by Louis Dumont's Homo hierarchicus, and you apply this term upon it, the caste system, you actually obscure your understanding of it. You obscure the historical reality, the diverse, complex historical reality that constituted it. Well, I suppose I've been able to respond to Professor Gandok's excellent question.
I'm going to flood you with one more. This is from Professor Sudarshan, who's the Dean of our school at Jindal Global University, the Dean of the School of Government and Public Policy. He writes, and this is on the public chat, forum. He says, "Dear Professor Saumya Day, the prevalence of conditioned imagination of India as the domain of impulsiveness and irrationality is indeed correct. Your initial scholarly discourse on the theories of history, Pliny, etc., used up a lot of time that could have been used to critique the situation now. Subaltern Studies was a refreshing departure from history written from the standpoint of the British Raj, even though the Bhadralok vantage could not be shaken away by historians of the subaltern school." And then he regrets he has to head off another meeting. If we can just have a couple of words, there's two more questions, I think. One more question after that. So if I could have just a couple of words on your response, perhaps to Professor Sudarshan's comment about...
As about the regret that, talking about Pliny and not Pliny, actually Livy and Polybius, I used up time, but that is because of my training, since I'm a student of the discipline of history, this is how we approach a subject matter. It's a time-consuming approach. We don't just jump into it. So we establish the premises first. So I established two premises first: what is a narrative and what constitutes essentialization, and we have to furnish examples. So I went by my training, Professor Sudarshan here, to respond to that bit of regret. And as about the subaltern studies, yes, it could have been a very refreshing and very enlightening departure from traditional ways of writing history, because well, kind of a Marxist humanism, for example, or what is remembered as Marxist humanism today, had opened up these vast spaces for us to explore. I mean, this monumental study, truly a monumental study, by Thompson, E.P. Thompson, Making of the English Working Class, the profoundest, the greatest instance of Marxist humanism, in which he considered culture as a category of a class formation. So this vast space had been opened up to us, to Marxist humanism, and it was for the subaltern studies scholars to exploit. But then, they thought of the subaltern in terms of these binaries: elite mindset, subaltern mindset. E.P. Thompson does not do that. He does not talk about a working class mindset. For example, he discusses how Methodism, for example, shaped the working class, and Methodism made the working class patriotic and committed to the British state. So, as far as Marxist humanism is concerned, class formation can take these diverse routes, even the routes which probably a traditional Marxist or probably Karl Marx himself would not have approved of. A class as it is forming, a class such as the working class as it is forming, it can imagine itself with a certain kind of spirituality, and while it does that, it can even get more and more invested in the culture, in the society that it is embedded in, which, by the way, treats it very badly. Let us not forget that the working class were doing 15-hour shifts while they were converting to Methodism, and while Methodism was converting them into, patriotic British citizens. And by the way, when the First World War broke out, what did they do? They marched off by the thousands to fight the Germans, didn't they? None of them said that we won't fight. There were pacifists, pacifists galore among the British elite, but none among the working class. By the way, these are uncomfortable realities which these radical culturalists have to take note of, but they don't. They don't at all, and this is poor scholarship. Anyway, so the subaltern studies project could have been a very, very refreshing departure, but it embedded itself in these binaries and crudities and a certain kind of elitism, and I think lost the plot. That is my response to Professor Sudarshan if he's here. Okay, I can.
There's just one more, and then we'll go to some concluding remarks. So one more. We have a representative from the South Asian Times here, and our colleague here in the audience has asked, contemporary political issues generate criticism. So how does it become a colonial approach?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily be a manifestation of the colonial approach, but it can still bear the colonial baggage, because the language is a very political thing, and sometimes we are not aware of what we are saying. Like a toddler learning, acquiring the faculty of speech, for example. A toddler, for example, frequently says things which need not be said in society, and parents have to chide the toddler. You cannot say this. So that is our situation sometimes as journalists and academics. We are not aware of what we are saying. I mean, take for instance, the journalistic interpretation of Trump. He's built up as some sort of, kind of white supremacists, and it is argued, it is implicitly suggested that white supremacism that brought him the presidency of the United States. It is not that. I mean, there might be white supremacists among people who voted for Trump, but definitely that is a very crude, incorrect, erroneous interpretation of what brought Trump to power. Similarly, I mean, when I see the journalistic interpretations of what brought Modi to power, it is a very crude, frequently a very crude, erroneous interpretation. Of course, you ought to criticize Trump and Modi. These are democracies, and in democracy, no one should be spared criticism, especially people who have come to power with such big majorities, because the word demagogue, by the way, originally meant a man of the people. It did not contain a negative charge. So as far as the original meaning of the word demagogue goes, both Modi and Trump are men of the people. I mean, I live in a very, a very unglamorous neighborhood of people, and I see that Modi's ratings are still very high. My neighbors are very working class people, and Modi's ratings are very high among them. And it is not because of the religious impulse, it is because of something else. And it is a journalist's responsibility to understand this something else, the academic's responsibility to understand this something else, while of course, definitely criticizing Modi when he deserves criticism, when he warrants criticism. But if you are stuck in these frames, white supremacism, Hindutva fascism, you misrepresent realities. I'm not denying that there are white supremacists in the United States. They are there. Racism is an issue. Just as religious fundamentalism is an issue, or Hindu irredentism is an issue. Of course, it is an issue, but these are not the impulses fundamental impulses which brought Modi or Trump to power. If you're talking in these terms, you are committing an error. This is my response.
Sorry, I was just muted. I think that's a nice point to leave off on, because I was just reflecting as you were just winding up there on the rigor that you bring to the academic rigor that you bring to this endeavor, and you sort of charge us all with the challenge to sort of not be as reductive and indeed as more nuanced and subtle with our analysis, whether it be in the academic world or the media journalistic world. So thank you very much. Thank you all. I noticed we've just got 1 or 2 minutes to go, so I'm just going to wrap up here, and I really want to thank you, the audience, for participating, both in terms of coming here and listening, and also in asking some superb questions and challenging us to respond. I draw your attention to further events in the co-hosted India Week, co-hosted by Jindal Global University and the Australia-India Institute. There are further events coming up this week. Some of those events can be found, or those events can be found on the Australia-India website, the Australia-India Institute's website, the AII website, and you can get a sense of the sort of activities and events planned. So I encourage you to take part and to drop in for the further panel discussions that are going on. My colleagues are participating, and my friends from Australia are also participating. And I thank you all for coming here today to take part in this wonderful, for me, it's been enlightening as well. You bring an incredible rigor and systematic approach to your delivery, Professor Day. I've been very impressed. So thank you very much. And my hat's off. To you all, everyone else, have a good day. Have a good afternoon here in India, a good evening in Australia, good morning perhaps in other parts of the world as well. And I hope to see you in some of our other events, the India Week events in the next couple of days. Thank you so much. All the best. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Jayasinghe. Thank you, colleagues.
Bye for now.
Bye.